Here's what's coming up on episode 77 of the Big Seance Podcast. Jim Harold.
I said, well, you know what? Why don't I have the listeners call in and tell their spooky stories? That'd be fun for kind of a one-off episode. That'll be something different. And when I did that, it was like, whoa, the reaction to this, and people love this. And one of the biggest compliments I've ever gotten on the show, someone said that they had gotten pulled over in Texas by a policeman, and they were playing the Campfire podcast. And the policeman said, give me the name of that podcast. And I said, well, but the important thing is, did you get out of the ticket? And she said, no, I didn't get out of the ticket. But he's very nice about it. And the older gentleman there says, you know, there was a woman murdered in this room about a month ago. First of all, I think that there is a need for people to feel they're not alone, and that they're not the only ones experiencing this. I think people have an innate fear of being judged when they tell a story like this. And I think one of the reasons the show has resonated is I don't judge and I don't make fun. And, you know, who am I to say that you say that Abraham Lincoln came up to you and shook your hand? Who am I to say that he didn't? Adult coloring books are very popular now. And what would be cooler than to have an adult coloring book where it's based on the Campfire and we have little vignettes? Now, there was only one problem in my grand plan, Patrick. I can't draw a stick man.
So, do you remember what was going on in your mind during that first interview? And, did you have any idea what you were starting?
Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Several episodes ago, I mentioned that very soon I would be an overnight guest at the haunted Lemp Mansion in St. Louis. I didn't tell you when because I didn't want creepers, and I mentioned the possibility of me maybe ending up being in the mansion by myself. Well, that was last week. I'm not going to give too much away because I plan on doing a whole episode on that experience eventually. But if you're interested, I wanted to point you in the direction of a few Facebook Live videos that I did later in the evening when I was at the Lemp. You can find those videos if you're a member of the Big Seance Parlor, our group on Facebook. Just request to join, and I'll add you to the group. I just have to say, those paranerds who joined me helped add to the coolness of the evening. And I'm not going to lie, I was very anxious about going. It got worse and worse as the day got going. And once I left, I just got more and more anxious. And I wasn't expecting this because I've done some pretty, what most people would think of as creepy things, and haven't been incredibly worried about it. But, not knowing how the night would end up and not knowing if I would really, end up by myself. And I ended up being more chicken than I thought I would be, sadly. So having some paranerds with me really helped, and it was so fun. I'm kind of in trouble, though, for using so much data on my phone when I wasn't on Wi-Fi. And one of those videos, I think, is an hour and a half long. So it was like a virtual slumber party with a lot of you at the Lemp is basically what it was. I'm hoping I don't forget anybody, but I think the live viewers that evening were Paul, Stormy, Jennifer and Jennifer, Rob, Diana, Lena and John, Jeffrey, Josh, Pat, Viv, and Marion. And most of these folks stayed with me the entire time, which is insane, considering it was late for most of you and you didn't plan it. I popped up on your feed as being at the Lemp and being live, and you stayed with me. Well, the very next morning, after sleeping maybe 2 hours in a haunted house, I met up virtually with Karen A. Dahlman and her board partner, Rodney, and we recorded our special Halloween seance for 2016. It's become quite a production to put together, and I kind of knew that going into it, but it was great. It'll probably be fairly close to Halloween when that goes out, just in case you're sitting there waiting and refreshing the page at bigseance.com. So thank you for being patient, and thanks for submitting all of those questions too, those of you who did that. So anyway, that is coming soon. After having so much fun with Facebook Live videos from LEMP, I decided to do another one this last weekend, but this time showcasing my Halloween altar that I mentioned so often and other decorations here at the parlor. And once again, Paranerds showed up. I love how that works. And I also took some artsy-fartsy photos of it all, which I think came out pretty cool. And those can be found in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook as well. So you probably have to cruise quite a ways down to find these videos and to find the photos because the parlor's been picking up in activity. So, but they're there, I promise you. Lots of things going on. October is like the Christmas season for some of us, I guess. So things have been kind of busy, haven't they? I'm going to go ahead and jump into the interview with Jim Harold. And a little bit later, we'll have another installment of Tim Prossel's Spectral Edition. And, of course, some listener feedback after that. So thanks for being here today. It's time to serve the tea or the coffee. Just be sure to use a saucer, please. Well, Jim Harold has been a guest that I like to bring back around this time every year because he keeps writing books and compiling spooky stories. Most of you are well aware that he is the host of the Paranormal Podcast and Jim Harold's Campfire. He's also an author, like I said, and we'll talk more about that later as well, and the host of many other podcasts. As he would say, and I hope I don't mess this up, he's the chief bottle washer over at jimharold.com. Did I get your line right?
Chief cook and bottle washer.
Okay. Chief cook and bottle washer. So welcome back to the Big Seance Parlor, Jim.
Hey, great to be here. My other line's the Major Domo. You're the Major Domo at the Big Seance Podcast.
Well, I've been listening to your shows for so long. And for a couple of years, the Paranormal Podcast was your main show. And I've mentioned that show a lot in a lot of the interviews that have really influenced me over the years. But then there came to this point where you decided to try something new. And you kicked off Jim Harold's Campfire. And then suddenly this thing over the years has just exploded. And I don't think we've ever talked about this inspiration specifically. So what inspired Jim Harold's Campfire, the podcast?
I think it was just looking for a topic for a show. I wanted to do something different, just on a paranormal podcast episode for that show. And I said, well, you know what? Why don't I have just the listeners call in and tell their spooky stories? That'd be fun for kind of a one-off episode. That'll be something different. And when I did that, it was like, whoa, the reaction to this, and people love this. And I'm like, well, I'm not the sharpest tool in the drawer, but you know, when you do something and people say, I want more of that, yeah, give them more of that. So in 2009, I started the Campfire. I think originally it was kind of an every other week deal. And now it's published pretty much every week, and it's a weekly podcast, and people call in from all over the world. And the proposition is simple. I stay out of the way. I basically say, Patrick, you're calling us today from Missouri. Tell us your spooky story. What happened to you? Or I hear that your mother contacted you, or whatever it might be for this person. And they just tell their story. And the best thing I can do is just kind of clam up and listen to their story. And maybe once in a while interject a question here or there.
And I know you've talked about this too. A lot of times, and I just want people to know this, a lot of times when people call for the first time, and I called your show for the first time, even before I started this podcast, and I was so very nervous. And you do a really good job at calming people down before they record. And you also have people that now you've got some callers that have called, I don't know how many, 15, 20 times. They get so comfortable with you.
We have regulars. Travis from California is probably the main guy you're thinking of. He calls us. He has, I believe it was his grandmother's house, and it's haunted. It's in the family, and all these things keep happening. Every month or two, he'll call up and kind of give us the latest update of the strange goings on. And the thing that I tell people is because literally, it is me talking with them over a phone line, and I'm like, just tell me your story. Don't even think about anybody out there listening, and it's worked well. The other weird thing about this show, and this has happened multiple times, the way we produce the show is, it's difficult when you're a podcaster to take incoming phone calls, and it could get very complicated. So essentially what we do is we take a block of time, like, for example, a Thursday night from 10 to midnight Eastern time, and we'll have a sign-up form. And people will sign up to that form to be on at that time, and then I will call out to them and record the stories one by one. And then we kind of put it together kind of like a model railroad. Each call is just like a car in a model railroad, and we just kind of mix and match. And the interesting thing is, and this has happened multiple times.
I know what you're going to say. I love this.
We've had multiple times where, frankly, I look at the calls pretty much right before I make the call. And I'll have someone, let's say, that calls about a doppelganger. And then I'll have another person calls about a ghost. And then I have another person's on a doppelganger. And then there'll be one about a shadow person. Then there'll be another one the same night about a doppelganger. It's like the show is like produced by some unseen hand and just say, Jim, make the show about doppelgangers. It's just really, really weird. And that has happened multiple times. And they'll be off the wall things. It won't be, I saw a ghost of grandma, although we get that sometimes. But it'll be some fairly arcane thing. And 2 or 3 people will call in one night and have similar experiences. So maybe there's something supernatural to that. And we usually have about half a dozen stories per show. We try to keep it to under 10 minutes a call. Show clocks in these days. It used to be shorter, but now we usually give people around an hour of content, sometimes a little more, sometimes slightly less. But we shoot for that hour mark. So you get a heap and helping of Campfire stories. And one of the biggest compliments I've ever gotten on the show, well, there's 2 of them. And they're kind of similar. One just came on Facebook today. Someone said that they had gotten pulled over in Texas by a policeman, and they were playing the Campfire podcast. And the policeman said, "Give me the name of that podcast." And I said, the important thing is, did you get out of the ticket? And she said, "No, I didn't get out of the ticket," but he's very nice about it. And then on the other side of the fence, a similar story, law enforcement officer was a listener to the show. And one night, I guess they were listening to Campfire, and they had a perp in the back seat, and they're listening to the Campfire. The policemen are, or the policeman is, and the guy in the back of the car who's been arrested, he said, "Could you turn that up a little bit? That's pretty interesting." So, so I just thought those are kind of funny stories.
You could grab a few of those for a back of a book one of these days.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Perp in back of car.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and then when I looked, he wasn't there. No, he's a ghost.
Well, you mentioned, this magic kind of thing that happens. And it happened on your recent episode as of this recording. Actually, now there's one where your opening story is a really creepy story about a hotel.
Oh, yeah. That one freaked me out. That's one of my all-time favorite. There are probably about 10 or 15 stories that rank among my favorite of all time, and they all eventually find their way in one of the books. But the thing is, the truth is that we're a couple of years ahead on the shows as opposed to the books. So this will be in a book in about 2018. But but this story was great. This was a gentleman, Texas again. He was on a business trip. And he went to, got a room in a hotel. Went out with some clients that night, I guess, and came back to the hotel kind of late, and he couldn't get in the room. This is in the 90s. So he had a key card, and those were still relatively new back then. He took it downstairs to the clerk, who was new as well, and said, I think I demagnetized my card here. Can you give me a new one? No problem. Gives him a new one, goes back up, tries to swipe it again. Won't let him in the room. So he goes down. There's a clerk there. And he said, hey, can you come up and help me? Because this key card isn't working. And clerk goes up with him, tries his master key. Doesn't work. So anyway, he calls security. And security comes across on the walkie-talkie and says something to the effect, I don't remember the exact room number, but something like, it's not room 315, is it? And yeah, it's 315. So kind of some kind of old grizzled guy comes up, and he's trying to open the door, and he said, you can't get in because it's deadbolted. And it's like, deadbolted? I was the only one that was in there. No one was in there. How would that happen? And then the guy starts listening inside the room, and there's like this rustling and like somebody's in the room. Eventually they get in. There's no one in the room, but this guy's clothes are strewn all about like somebody ransacked the place. And the older gentleman there says, there was a woman murdered in this room about a month ago. Let me show you something. And they opened up some kind of, I forget what it was, some kind of container or something. And there was actually still a little bit of where a carpet had been cut out, but there's a little bit of dried blood, which I thought, boy, that's not very clean. But I would hope you at least sanitize the place. But anyway, the guy told him, he said, there's been all kinds of activity here the last month. People have complained about somebody in the room making all kinds of noise, disturbing them. People have been locked out of the rooms. And he said, I assume you don't want to stay in this room. And our caller's like, no. So they moved him to another room, and that was his story. And I thought that was really cool, because those are my favorite kind of stories from this standpoint. We have a lot of people who listen to our shows. They're maybe active in the ghost hunting community, those kind of things. God bless them. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I like the stories where somebody's just trying to get a good night's sleep and they're visited by a ghost, or they're just trying to do their job and something weird happens. Because to me, those are the interesting stories, when it's not necessarily when you're looking for the supernatural and you find it. It's when you're just minding your own business and it finds you.
It would be interesting to put an episode together of just hotel workers who have hotel stories.
I tried to do that with health workers. I didn't get a lot of response. I don't know if it's because they're afraid of HIPAA or privacy. Of course, we would never divulge any personal information along that line. And this isn't in a book either, but this is a good story we had over the last few months. I titled the episode "Me and Mrs. Jones," but it wasn't like the song. This gentleman was kind of a night orderly, I believe, at a senior citizens home. There's probably a better word for that, but that's essentially what it was. And he was walking and doing the rounds at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And he saw one of the patients, Mrs. Jones, walking down the hall with her walker, and she waved and smiled at him, and he waved and smiled. And he said, that's not altogether unusual. Sometimes older people like that, elderly people, will kind of walk around at night. Maybe they can't sleep. And then a couple hours later, he's walking down the hall again, and here comes Mrs. Jones. She's smiling, doesn't say anything, and just kind of smiles and waves. And he's like, okay. So the next morning, the new shift comes in, and they have like a transition little powwow where they talk about, patients to observe and different things going on. So they'll have a sense of the situation so they can keep an eye on things, the new shift. And this gentleman told his colleagues, he said, I kind of watch out for Mrs. Jones. She was very restless last night. I saw her walking around 2 or 3 times down the hall. And one of the other staff members, one of the incoming one, shift worker, says, were you here over the last couple of days? And he's like, no, I've been off the last few days. He said, well, that couldn't have been Mrs. Jones. She died 2 days ago. So it makes you think, Patrick. It makes you think.
It does. Very creepy. And I neglected in the beginning to mention that it's your book, True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire Volume 5, that just recently came out. And so we want to talk about a few of those stories from the book? Because it's out there and available in all formats, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the fifth book. The good thing about the books is you can read them in any order. Each one has 70 stories of the supernatural. They clock in at usually around 250 print pages. So it's not a pamphlet. It's a nice size book. And the cool thing I love with digital delivery these days, you can get any of those books for $2.99 on the Kindle. And people used to say, and I think they're realizing now, but they used to say, I don't have a Kindle. I bet you have a smartphone. Well, if you have a smartphone, you can get a free Kindle app on iOS or Android or a tablet or even a computer. So if you're listening to this show, you can read a Kindle book, and $2.99 a book for a full-length book, I think, is pretty good. And you could even get the whole series for, I think it's about $14.95. You can get all 5 books, and you can read them in any order. And then also, of course, there are many people out there said, the e-reader thing is not for me. So each of the books is also available as a paperback. Obviously, that's going to be more than the electronic book because there's a cost of paper and printing and all that good stuff. But that way you kind of have a physical record of it. So you can also pick those up as well. And the new one is doing great. Each of the books at one time or another has hit #1 status in the Kindle store in the supernatural category. And this one has followed suit and had a great appearance on Coast to Coast AM 2-3 weeks ago. And that really always helps to coordinate the launch with that. It's always a big help. And being on great shows like yours is also very helpful to kind of spread the word about the books.
And so do you know, as you're listening to someone's story on the Campfire, is there a moment where you always just know, yep, that's going in a book. Yep, that's going in 2018.
In extreme cases, like the 2 that I just told you, both of those will be in a book. Yes. Now, there's some that are kind of like, because what I like to do is kind of look at maybe a year's worth of shows and pick. So the idea is that, and literally these are stories probably from 2013, but I usually kind of limit it to about 50 shows. So I pick the best of 50. So you don't always know, or maybe even 30 or 40 shows. You don't always know, but there are a few cases where you absolutely know. And both of those they're going in the book. And the good thing is, somebody had asked me about this. Well, do you have permission to put these stories in the book? Well, when people sign up, we have a nice little checkbox there, and it says that this story may be used in a book or other derivations, because we always want to be upfront with people. And we always shoot them out a copy of the book when it's released. We let them know that they're in it, and I've had nothing but positive feedback on that, and it's really been nice. And the thing is that the other benefit of doing the books, other than just like a business benefit, is some people may never listen to a podcast, but a lot of people read books. I mean, I've had one of my favorite reviews on the new book was, I have no idea who Jim Harold is whatsoever. But I like this book, and I think I'll check him out. I thought that was great, because that's part of the idea too. It's kind of a discovery, so people maybe will tune into the podcast, and also it's another way for these stories to go forward, because who knows if somebody will listen to old files of my podcast once I'm dead and gone. But I bet somebody will read a book.
Well, I'm still making my way through these stories, but I can tell you the first story in the book is amazing. It's called The Fire Marshal Car, and I wondered if you'd tell us that one.
Yeah, that is a freaky one. That's Chris from Alabama, and it's a really very sad story. Now, some of the stories that we have are very simple, and some are very elaborate, and this definitely is on the more elaborate side. Chris talked about when he was a little boy, they'd moved in a new house. It was a little hard for him to sleep, but he eventually got used to it. But one thing would happen about 1 or 2 o'clock every morning, and it kept waking him up. And it was a sound of a beep, a door shutting, and then a beep. And he figured it was somebody fooling with the microwave. But he said this one night he was going to figure it out. So that night he woke up, he heard the beep, and immediately opened his door. And he said directly across from him was his parents' room, and his mother came out at the same time. And what they saw blew their minds. It was a boy of 6 or 7 years old, about Chris's age at the time, standing in the living room. He was shimmering, and they could see his features. He had on a white T-shirt and blue jeans. They said that they saw this little boy walk from the living room into another bedroom, and then basically in the bedroom disappear into another door, just into thin air. And it's kind of like the mom didn't want to acknowledge it to Chris. Chris didn't want to acknowledge it to his mom. They just kind of let it lie. But that wasn't the end of the strange activity. A couple of years later, it was Christmas, and Chris said he had a big family, I think 5 boys, and they would get a ton of toys. In this particular year, they got a firefighter set. And in the firefighter set was a fire marshal's car. You've seen them before. They're kind of like Ford Crown Victorias, that kind of car. And the funny thing about this car, and they had a ton of family over, I think they had something like 25 people over, it started going off. And it would stop, and then it would go off, and it would stop, and it would go off. And everybody kind of thought the car was defective, bad wiring, bad battery, something like that, except for the grandma of the family. She began to question if it was something else, if it was a spirit. So she began to ask for the toy car, to turn off on demand. She said, if you're a spirit, please turn the lights on. And it would do it every single time. And when she would ask it to stop, it would stop. And Chris says all 25 people saw this, and they could witness to it to this day. So they kept the car for several years, never fixed it, never replaced the batteries, and it would do the same thing over this course of several years. Especially at family gatherings around the holidays, it would become very active. So it kind of ties into something that brings it to total closure, even though it's very tragic. Chris's brothers did some work for an elderly man down the road. He had some pecan trees, and they helped him pick the pecans, and they picked buckets and get $5 a bucket. Well, one day, apparently, there was some kind of disagreement. So the old man came over to the house to get it resolved, over to Chris's house. But when he got there, he wouldn't come in. He told the mother of the family, I can't come in there. I didn't know you guys lived here. And Chris's mom said, what do you mean? And the old man said that he knew the family that had lived there before Chris's family, and that he had a connection to him, and he wouldn't come in. He said there was a 6-year-old boy and his mother who lived there before, who would come to his house and help him clean up. This was after his wife passed away. One day they were in the backyard. They were burning a pile of rubbish, and the boy picked up a gas can. This little 6-year-old boy, got too close to the fire. The can exploded, and it killed him. When the old man called for help, his neighbor came over, and they extinguished the flames. They carried the boy over to the neighbor's car. The neighbor's car was a fire marshal's car. The neighbor was a fire marshal, and tragically, the boy died in that very car. The old man said, I'll never forget that day. I can remember everything that little boy was wearing, from his white T-shirt to his blue overalls. So it all kind of tied everything together tragically, but neatly. And Chris said it was totally beyond coincidence. It was something spiritual, something paranormal. He said the poor boy was communicating with them the whole time.
That is so sad. It's
yeah,
spooky.
It is.
A hair-raising feeling.
Yeah, and the thing about the book, the book is broken up in several categories because, the kind of the plurality of it is ghost stories, but we also have black-eyed kids, shadow people, a couple of cryptid stories, a couple of Ouija stories, UFO stories, head scratchers, and then we have something called the softer side of spooky, because I think when you talk about this stuff, everybody thinks it's terrifying and it's scary, and some of it is. I just did an interview today with somebody about shadow people. That's a scary subject. So some of it is creepy, and some of it is frightening, and some of it's quite poignant and touching. I think it's a lot like life. When we look at the supernatural, it's not all good, it's not all bad, it's not all evil. It's on a continuum, just like our everyday life. That's kind of the way I look at it, and I try to make the books reflect that.
Now, I don't want to be like, I could selfishly ask for, ghost stories and like haunted home stories, but I know that there has to be some paranerds listening that are like, oh gosh, Patrick, why don't you ever, cover UFOs or something like that? Do you have anything completely on the opposite side from this book, an interesting story you could share?
Well, actually, there's a UFO story in this book I'd like to share, and it is kind of wild. That's why I love this one. It's called Old School UFOs. It's by TJ. He currently lives in Finland, but I guess he was from Tennessee. And this story is about his dad and his uncle. And he said that his dad was a salt of the earth guy. He was born in the early 1930s in Jamestown, Tennessee. He was very rural. And when he was 10 years old, he had a very strange experience that he never liked to talk about. It happened in 1942. So we're talking pre-Roswell here. And he said that one night his dad woke up and found himself outside. Didn't know how he'd gotten there. He apparently had been sleepwalking. He looked into the night sky and saw a cigar-shaped glowing craft floating above him, and then it flew off. Now, that's kind of a strange experience and something you would kind of pass along to generations. But it is nothing compared to the story his uncle had. So TJ was talking to his uncle recently, and that was his dad's brother. His dad's since passed. And TJ's uncle said he was in the 8th or 9th grade when he had a really strange experience in the same area. And that's why I think they may be connected. TJ's uncle had been out with his grandma picking berries. He had picked his gallon of berries, so he figured he'd head back home. And as he was walking through the woods, he saw two bizarre creatures. And TJ asked him, what did he look like? And TJ assumed he was going to say, well, traditional gray aliens with big black eyes. But his uncle said, no, they were really small and they had 4 arms. He said one of them was down in a hole in the ground and the other one was standing above the hole. And they were pulling metallic looking rocks up out of the ground. TJ's uncle said, I didn't understand what was going on. And they saw me observing. Then TJ's uncle said these aliens started walking up a nearby hill. His uncle followed them. He came upon a spacecraft, but he couldn't see the creatures anymore. He said the craft was circular, like the traditional saucer that we see in the movies. He walked up to it, and he saw it had a ramp coming down, but the door open. He tripped on the ramp, and then he decided, maybe I ought to leave. So TJ's uncle left. He went back down the hill and found his sister, Louise. He told her all about the spacecraft and back to where he'd seen all of this. They went back, and of course, the hole in the ground was gone, and so was the ship. There wasn't any trace of anything having been amiss. Now, the one thing that TJ says about his dad was my dad was open to this kind of stuff, but he would also tell you straight out if he thought something was BS. And my man, he was completely credible, and I always believed him. He never made a big deal of these things. In fact, my mother never even knew about his weird encounter until I told her about it after his death. Now, part of me wonders, was TJ's uncle pulling his leg? Or did he have some funny berries? Or did he see aliens? That's the question.
4 arms, man.
And pulling strange metallic objects out of the ground. But who am I to say?
Right.
I mean, that's the thing. People will say, are these true stories? And here's what I will say. I try to include the stories on here where I feel people, first of all, I feel the vast majority of people who call the shows are sincere and they believe what they're telling me happened to them. And many times they believe it has a supernatural origin. Sometimes people don't say that. They just say it was weird. I don't know what it was. So I believe they are sincere. Can I vouch for every story being 100% true? No, because I can't investigate it. And some of these things are uninvestigatable. There's really, if Aunt Martha comes to you in a dream and gives you some message, and we have a lot of stories along those lines, there's no way for me to independently verify that. But I do really try to focus on stories where I think people are giving me the legitimate straight skinning on what they believe happened.
And I know that there has to be people out there that, are good with not knowing whether the story is true or not.
Right.
Good story.
I was on a podcast the other day, and the person's like, well, the problem I have with this book is, a lot of these stories, there's no closure. And it's like, well, welcome to real life. I mean, if I look back, for example, there's a couple girls in high school, I kind of go and it's like, well, what if, don't tell my wife, but anyway, my point is that that's life, and everything isn't always wrapped up with a pretty bow. And what I do with these stories is take you through the process a little bit. Is we take the recordings, we transcribe them. Then I go through the recordings, I go through the transcripts, and I select the best stories. Then at that point, I start to rewrite them, but not for information and facts, but just to make them flow better. And some of them are virtually untouched from what folks say on the air. And then some people, get nervous or just maybe not have the best command of the language or whatever it might be. So we have to edit those and kind of rewrite the same thought and make sure not to change it. And none of these stories pretty much are written the way that I would write them from scratch. The basis is the way that the story was told, but we maybe move a paragraph here, move a paragraph there, but we don't change it. And if it's an open-ended story where there's really never any resolution, it goes into the book and it's an open-ended story with really no resolution.
Jim, with close to 300 Campfire episodes out at this point, what, if anything, have you learned about how people experience or share their paranormal experiences over the years?
First of all, I think that there is a need for people to feel they're not alone and that they're not the only ones experiencing this. I think people have an innate fear of being judged when they tell a story like this. And I think one of the reasons the show has resonated is I don't judge and I don't make fun. And I made that little joke about the berries, but I don't, but in general, I don't, who am I to say that, if you say that Abraham Lincoln came up to you and shook your hand, who am I to say that he didn't? Actually, there's a great story about Winston Churchill, who supposedly saw the ghost of Lincoln when he was staying at the White House. And he was just getting out of the bath and he was completely naked and he saw Lincoln. And he told the ghost of the former president, "Sir, I'm afraid you have the advantage on me." but anyway, but anyway, I don't know if that's true or not, or just apocryphal tale, but it's great.
I've heard that one. I like it.
Yeah. But anyway, I think that people have a need to feel that there's I hate to say safe space because that annoys me, but a place where they can share without being judged or made fun of, and to know there's other people who have experienced similar things. And that's what we try to create, is a very kind of comforting, assuring space. We have a great Facebook group, which I'd like to invite everybody to. It's Jim Harold's Virtual Campfire. And we have about 7,500 members over there. And it's only been up for about a year. And I really regret not doing that years ago. But it's great because people in general have a very good spirit about sharing, and they're in general, they may say, well, I don't see what you're showing me in this picture, but you're still a good person. In general, the community has been very self-policing, and we try to be supportive of each other in sharing our stories. So I'd invite everybody to check that out as well as the podcast. But that's the environment we try to create. And the other thing I'd say, a couple of things, there are a lot of commonalities among the stories. And that's another reason I think they're true, because people will report several things. Now I have a couple of my co-producers here, my dog's barking. So if they're in the background, I apologize. But they're running the board. But anyway, got distracted by the mailman. But there's a lot of commonalities in the stories, but there's a wide range of stories. And the funny thing is that I figure since 2009, I've done about 250 shows or something like that of the Campfire. The point is that you're talking about probably about 1,500 stories, I'm guessing. It might be more than that. So you think you've heard it all, but somebody will always come through with the stories like, whoa, I've never heard one like that. So that's always a fascinating aspect of it too. It never gets old because people have fresh stories, fresh experiences. And I really appreciate, I kind of look at it as like a stewardship, that they will tell their stories and share their stories on our show, in our Facebook community, because sometimes they're very personal stories that have to do with a loved one or those kind of things. So I really do appreciate it when they give us that opportunity.
I want to make sure we don't run out of time to mention the adult coloring book that you also have out now. How in the world does that come about?
I knew that there had been a great interest in adult coloring books. I listened to some different podcasts and things because I'm very interested in publishing and self-publishing, because my first book was essentially published by a major publisher, and it was in Barnes & Noble, and that was great. But I found for me and my community, I could give them a better deal on the book. I could actually sell more books. and get it out to a wider audience, ironically, if I did it through my own company, which I do now. But I guarantee you look at this book and you can't tell the difference between one published from a major company. We have editors. I have a formatter who has worked in the publishing industry for decades. So it's indistinguishable from something that would come from one of the big publishers. But the point is that I said, well, adult coloring books are very popular now. And what would be cooler than to have an adult coloring book where it's based on the Campfire and we have little vignettes. Now, there was only one problem in my grand plan, Patrick. I can't draw a stick man. However, luckily, I know an artist who can draw a lot more than a stick man, Len Peralta. He's actually done concept art for the Ghostbusters movie that was out this last year, probably the best part of that movie. And also, he's done work with some of the alumni of Mystery Science Theater 3000 and worked on projects with them. So this is like a world-class artist who happens to live, in my general area here in northeastern Ohio. And we knew each other from online and stuff. And I called him up and I said, I've got this idea. Would you work with me? And we worked it out and he did it. So really, I was more of a curator saying, let's do these stories. Here are kind of like maybe some of the concepts. And we put together, there's 25 scenes in there. And it's really just brilliantly done. And the name of that is The True Ghost Story Adult Coloring Book with Jim Harold and illustrated by Len Peralta. And he is a talent and I'm honored that he worked with me on it.
Well, there you go. You adult coloring nerds can check that out.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's got 32 reviews, 5 out of 5 stars. So the people who get it love it. I just wish more people would get it.
Well, they need to. So last question, a selfish question for me. And then I would definitely want to, we'll talk about where to get the books and where people can sign up to share their stories and all of that. So I'm getting ready to interview the amazing Lloyd Auerbach.
Oh, he's fantastic.
And I can't help but remember that Lloyd was your very first podcast interview, I think in 2005. So do you remember what was going on in your mind during that first interview? And did you have any idea what you were starting?
First of all, I had no idea what I was starting. And I'm like, how do I get through this without sounding like an idiot to the 3 people who are going to listen or to Lloyd? Those were the 2 things I was thinking. Yeah. And then the next week for UFO nerds out there, I had Stanton Friedman. So it's one of those things where
you hit it off with big guests.
Yeah. And I think it was because it was kind of a mixed blessing because nobody knew what the hell a podcast was. A pod what? What's a pod? What? Whatever it is, I'll be on it, I guess. And I thought, I go back and listen to it. The audio quality makes my ears bleed, but they're still available over at my Plus Club. I leave those up there and I think I've come a long way, but I thought that the spirit of the show is exactly the same. It's not that different, but the spirit of what I was doing is the same. And that's kind of cool to know that you haven't gone too far off the rails with kind of your original intention. Because I think when you start out with something like this, you're very idealistic. And over time, people tend to get jaded about things. And I don't think that's happened with me. And it's kind of exciting that it hasn't, that I haven't become, oh, here we go, another UFO. I don't feel that way. And it's funny because you will get times where you get a little burnout and then you'll get like right now, I feel super invigorated. I mean, I've done something like 7 interviews in the last 2 days. And I feel re-energized and reinvigorated. And if it is a word, reinterested about the subjects that we cover. And it's always fascinating. It's always fun. We talked before how much fun it is to do this. I'm very grateful to do it. And I just appreciate the opportunity that people have given me and the fact that they'll listen.
Well, you know what? I know you hate when I gush, but you are the man, and I appreciate everything that you've done for, people looking for this kind of content and being an inspiration for people. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And I will say this, you're to be commended about what you've done. I was telling you off the air, you had taken a podcast class that I put up a couple of years ago, and you are the person out of all the people that took that course, the person who took the ball, they ran with it, they did something and kind of captured the spirit of what I was trying to communicate is like, people, the opportunity is here. All you have to do is follow through and do the steps. And you've done that. You've taken several levels above what I taught, and have progressed and improved. And you're to be commended, and you have one of the finest shows on the topic out there now. And I'm very proud of you, man.
You rock. I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so tell us where they can find the books. Tell us where they can go if they'd like to share stories with you. And, thanks for being on the show.
Well, it's been my pleasure. And where you go to kind of a hub is jimharold.com, JIMHAROLD.com. Of course, you can find the podcast, the free podcast, the Paranormal Podcast, and the Campfire. And you can find those on all of the podcast apps out there, whether we're talking about the iTunes or the podcast app from Apple, Pocket Cast, Overcast, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify. Basically, if it plays a podcast, you can type in Jim Harold or the Paranormal Podcast or Campfire, and it should come up. We're available on the Amazon Echo, TuneIn Radio, and it's amazing. That's an exciting part to how that's all expanded over the last few years. Just you can be everywhere. It's so cool. And then the books, of course, you can get those at Amazon.com. That's Amazon.com. I don't think I need to spell that. And just search for Jim Harold, JIMHAROLD, and really all 5 of the books should come up. And again, they're only $2.99 each on the Kindle. And then, of course, we have also a paperback edition of each of the 5 books for those who prefer the Dead Tree version.
I always prefer the Dead Tree version. Well, Jim, we will talk to you probably in another year when Campfire 6 is coming out.
Yes, I got to get to work. Believe me, it comes around faster than you think. You kind of go, another one's done. Oh, I've only got a month.
You better get on it.
That's right. Well, thank you, Patrick. So good to talk with you and with the big Seance audience.
Oh, thank you. And have a, Halloween is really close around the corner. Have a happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
You're listening to the Big Seance Podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
So this week, Tim Prussell has a really fascinating spectral edition that is very interesting to me, being a teacher. And so please enjoy this week's spectral edition on haunted schoolhouses. Thanks, Tim.
Welcome to Spectral Edition. I'm Tim Prussell. Houses aren't the only buildings that are haunted. In fact, sometimes schoolhouses are haunted. And I've got 2 articles that deal with that. The first one comes from the Pittsburgh Dispatch, June 22nd of 1891, and this one feels to me a little bit like kids being kids. The title is Spooks in a Schoolhouse, Detroit Children Frightened by a Ghost Clad in a Shroud. Detroit, June 21st. A number of the children attending the Russell School, located on Russell Street between Elliott and Benton Streets, believe the basement of the school is haunted by a ghost in the form of a man clothed in an immaculate shroud. Little Teddy Beach of 721 Rivard Street describes the specter as having only one large ear and a corresponding eye that sends forth brilliant scintillations. The apparition glides about the basement like a shadow and appears particularly during the afternoon when that department is deserted. 2 other small girls allege that they were terribly frightened last Thursday morning. The 2 were in the basement together when the alleged ghost appeared. They say it suddenly sprang up from the floor in the rear of their apartment, which back then meant room, and began to sway back and forth the breadth of the basement. The girl who spied it first uttered a scream and fell back into her companion's arms. The latter looked up just in time to see the specter evaporate. The girls at once informed their teacher of what they had seen. Other children tell similar stories. A little bit of Freddy Krueger in that story, isn't there? Maybe Freddy Krueger's grandfather? The second article shows perhaps the more serious side of haunted schoolhouses. It was published in the New Enterprise, a newspaper from Madison, Florida, and printed on September 26th of 1901. The headline is, Abandoned Schoolhouse to a Ghost. A ghost has received official recognition in the action of Trustee Jesse Martin of Jackson Township of Carroll County, Indiana, when he gave a contract for the erection of a new school building in the Walnut Grove district. Several years ago, Ammer Green was lynched by a mob for the murder of his sweetheart, Luella Mabbitt, the hanging taking place at a walnut tree in the Walnut Grove schoolyard. Since then, the children have been filled with superstitious terror in regard to the place, and the once large school dwindled to 2 pupils last winter, and after a few weeks' effort to get others to attend, school was dismissed. Strange stories were told about the place. Green's ghost was reported to have been seen, and the teachers reported that they heard unexplainable sounds about the building. The walnut tree, before then a large and thrifty one, never bore foliage after the lynching and stood a bleak reminder of the tragedy. No teacher could be found to accept the school for next winter, and in response to the insistent demands of the patrons, a new building will be erected a short distance away, the old site being abandoned. Well, I would say the first mistake was having a lynching on the schoolyard. This has been Spectral Edition. I'm Tim Prossel. I have close to 300 of these articles. They're all authentic. All of them were published in U.S. newspapers between the years of 1865 and 1918, and I post one each Wednesday on my website. The website is called The Merry Ghost Hunter, and you're very welcome to come visit.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Seance Podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
I received a nice email from April, as well as Heidi, in recent weeks. I had a cool talk with Pat from Ireland, and he told me a story I may share with you sometime, actually. I've talked to Doran, as well as Paula, who I strangely keep running into at events, even if we don't realize we're both there. So she must really be a paranerd. Actually, I know she is. I heard from Jesse, who is the owner of the very popular Belvoir Winery in Liberty, Missouri. So it was nice to talk to him again. He heard my interview with Amy Bruni and Adam Berry last week, and you may remember we talked about Belvoir a bit, and I'll never forget my visit to Belvoir. So thank you, Jesse. Murray Melder wrote this nice review in iTunes. He says, "My favorite podcast of all time," and it's 5 stars. "I've been listening to this podcast since July of this year, and it's been an eye-opening experience. Sure, there are many other podcasts that have to do with the paranormal world, but Patrick Keller really knocks it out of the park with his format. There is no other host as empathetic, kind, and informative on the air. When you're trying to fill your brain space with paranormal information or just listening for fun, this is the podcast for you." Well, you so rock, Murray. I happen to know that Murray's working on producing his own podcast he's getting ready to put out, and so I'll keep you posted on that. So, Murray, let me know when that happens, and we'll give it a mention. Bill Will 20 left a review in iTunes as well, and it's titled "Love to Be Informed." It's also 5 stars. "I have been listening to this podcast for a few months. I have become such a fan, looking forward to new episodes every week. The Amy and Adam episode was awesome. I'm a big fanboy of this duo as well. Thanks for such a great show." Well, thank you all for your reviews and your emails. Quite a few people have joined the Big Seance Parlor lately as well, so thanks for making contact in the last couple of weeks. It's really cool to get that stuff coming in. You guys totally rock, and it's time for me to peace out, y'all.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit BigSeance.com. Just click on the Big Seance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn Radio, and iHeartRadio. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to BigSeance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show.
Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time. Now, I want to make sure we don't And
then you've taken it above and beyond the things I've have taught. I speak good English.
Hey, you. Are you still listening? Yay, that makes me so happy. So I decided we haven't had a Paranerd hashtag in quite a while. So I think it's time. Head on over to Twitter. Tweet me. Include Jim Harold if you want to. His Twitter handle is @TheJimHarold. And include the hashtag Campfire5. And that's the number 5. So that's hashtag Campfire5. Can't wait to see how many hardcore Paranerds I have. Thanks for listening to the end.